right, good evening, everyone. Stick with us today as we welcome in Dennis Brennan, the author of DC Swamp Strikes Back, Aaron Burr, Donald Trump, and their similar battles. Stay with us for this exclusive that you do not want to miss. This is the Martin Memo. The Martin Memo. All right, sir. Well, welcome in. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Zachary. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we dive into all the nitty gritty and all the questions, just tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an attorney for over 30 years, former newspaper owner and editor, also was a reporter, small community papers, nothing to get too excited about. Although anymore, most people probably say newspaper. What the heck is that? Yeah. Most people don't read them. Out from that, I've also held public office, so I have a trifecta of things you could dislike. I was a village trustee here in Illinois, school board member. I was board president for 6 of the 8 years I was on the board. I even served in something called township collector, where you're paid $1 a year and you have no duties. So I've done all the bad jobs in government.
Yeah, apparently. Oh, Lord. I have family that's been all over as far as city government, from mayor to the president of downtown. So I know all about that line of work and how lovely some people can be. What made you decide to write the book, and why Aaron Burr and Donald Trump?
Yeah, the idea came after a friend of mine wrote a book about Aaron Burr, and he showed me the book. He said, "Here's a copy, let me read it." I did, and he came back a few weeks later to my office and said, "What do you think?" And this guy's a Democrat political consultant, does some big races, congressional races, statewide, bright guy, even though he votes differently than me. And I liked the book. I learned a lot about Aaron Burr, but I said, and I told him all that. But then I said, you missed the big story. And at this time, Donald Trump was running for what's his second term now. So we were still in the campaign. And I said, the way Aaron Burr was treated, which I didn't know, is how Trump has been treated. And he looked at me as if I had just gotten off a spaceship or something. And, but he's a nice guy, so he didn't argue. He just basically said, "You're nuts." And he didn't see that. I said, "I think there's a book there. I think I'm going to do it." So I started looking in Aaron Burr, realized I was right, he was wrong, as most Republicans will say. And the more I found out about Aaron Burr, and as I went back and, the Trump stuff was happening really in real time, so it was easier. And I could see a lot of comparisons, a lot of similarities, a few contrasts, but not many. And I thought this book can actually be something people might read.
And you've talked about media bias in a lot of your interviews and in the book. Is there any other factor that convinces you of media bias?
You could come up with something every day if you watch the media. There's, anybody that consumes, news, for instance, entertainment too, but mostly news. That's what really drives me crazy, because that's what journalism is. If they're putting it in the movies, I can complain, but I don't have the same basis, right? But, you just take something recently. They arrested the man who had placed the pipe bombs at the DNC and RNC sites. Cole's his last name, Brian Cole. And, it's funny because it took 5 years to track this guy down, which means you really weren't looking. Yeah. But, the media right away, or at least part of the media, tried to call him a Trump supporter. Mm-hmm. And they, Jake Tapper said he was white when he's really black. You're like, okay, you guys aren't doing much work to make sure these facts are right. But, I think what's worse than Jake Tapper getting the race wrong, you had CNN, NBC, and NPR. And NPR is supposed to be totally non-biased, right? Government funding and all. And they claimed that Cole had said the election was stolen in 2020,
Hmm.
which kind of supports their idea. Hey, this is a Trump guy,
Right.
and if you had Tapper in, it's a young white supremacist white guy that's.
Yeah.
But all that's false, and but they're trying to show his motivation. The problem is we blocked the bond materials before the 2020 election, so
Hmm.
obviously that can't be his motivation. And how they do this, and they do it all the time. They'll say an unnamed person close to the investigation. That's what
Yeah.
CNN, NBC, used, and actually NBC went one further, saying it was two people familiar with the investigation. Well, you and I were familiar with the
Yeah.
investigation.
Yeah. Right.
I really hate that idea that they don't quote anybody.
No.
And
No.
when I went to school and studied journalism, you had to have a source. If you didn't have one source on the record, you had to have two sources, and they had to be checked out. You
Yeah.
couldn't. Now it's people close to the investigation, whatever that means.
Right.
I, I can guarantee you this guy is not a Trump supporter. His family, his dad owns a company, a bail bonds company. They sued the Trump administration over illegal immigration and bonding people out. It's kind of insane that that's what they want to jump to. And
Right.
I don't care if he was a supporter. He should have been arrested 5 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
This motivation to try to stick him into some group and say it's a MAGA guy. Why are we reporting like that?
Right. Yeah.
I'd be more interested in reporting why did it take 5 years?
Yeah. I think that's worth a conversation. And then it's always funny to me once the real truth comes out how quickly that story seems to vanish, because now you turn on CNN today and they don't mention a lick of that anymore. So it's just awfully funny. And I believe that you touch on that. So
Right. They go on to the next story, and then people don't really remember, or they believe it. There's still people that believe Russian collusion was real. I've appeared on some broadcasts and podcasts where actually the host will argue it's real, or they'll argue on immigration. Like it's not a crime. I had to pull out the U.S. code and say, here is the code. It is a crime to illegally enter the country.
yes.
Why are you telling people something that's false? I mean,
Right.
and I'm going to, a podcaster, I'm holding anybody that's spreading news as a journalist. You're practicing journalism, sorry.
Well,
So do it right.
absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, sir, on that. Oh yeah. So there's a lot of disinformation out there. It's very unfortunate we live in a day and age where these people that are journalists, like you mentioned, just don't hold themselves to the true journalistic code, if you will.
Right.
Chapter 1 of your book talks about labels such as insurrectionist, traitor, or treasonous. What are some of the takeaways with those labels?
Yeah, the chapter, I did dedicate a chapter to this because it is so important the way so much of the media and, individuals use those terms. You hear the insurrection of January 6th, the insurrectionists of, that's lived with them now for 5 years.
Yeah.
And, a pardon's not going to erase that. People are still going to say that. And then you have, a little bit on both sides, but it really came up a lot in Trump's first term that he was treasonous or he's guilty of treason. I lay out the definitions. There's a clear definition of treason in this one that came up in the Aaron Burr trial. He was charged with treason twice, which most people remember. Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel that they had. We might not remember much more than that. It's a long time ago. School happened. And, some people will remember it when you tell them, well, Burr was charged. There was a Burr conspiracy, they called it. And he was charged with treason. It's like, oh, maybe I remember a little of that. But it's the definition of treason and the fact that you need like two witnesses to place you there that really allowed him to be acquitted. So it's important when we use these definitions, you know, we show you shouldn't be throwing around words like that. And I think the media should be sitting there going, well, he's not a traitor. He's not treason. It might be a bad decision by the president or one of his opponents, or maybe he did something else. And it's not insurrection. They weren't looking to overthrow the government. They were protesting. I'll give them that. That's true. And perhaps they wanted the vote to go a different way than it eventually went. But that's not insurrection. You didn't bring in arms into the place and say, we now are in charge. That didn't happen. So,
And the fact that some of those protesters were led into the Capitol, as more facts come out, it's just unreal that they keep going with that narrative, but it just goes to show you our modern day politics.
yeah.
The book details going toe-to-toe with the D.C. swamp. Can you explain that idea?
Yeah, a lot of people talk about the deep state, the D.C. swamp. My book has the title with D.C. swamp in it for a reason. I think of the D.C., the deep state being like the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, those people, not the people that are running it, but that are entrenched there. They're lifers. Mm-hmm. They're not leaving. And they seem to think that they have as much power as the president, the speaker, the Senate president. Yeah. And it's sometimes they do. The administrative part of our government has gotten out of hand over the years. And, the swamp, I think, extends to lobbying, media. I think that's the people that are around government all the time, but may not have an actual position in it. And it still gets the deep state. It's all part of the swamp. It's everything that makes up Washington. I think, it comes up, everybody is kind of aware of the swamp or the deep state because Trump brings it up a lot. And, he certainly had to battle even his own party when he went in there. Paul Ryan, his own party was not on board. Others the same way. Some of his own appointees, Bill Burr as Attorney General, a good lawyer, but perhaps not the guy you want as your gunslinger if you're making changes or you're fighting the people that he's basically been doing business with for his whole career. I mean, he's a Washington insider. And, this time you see Trump not choosing those people. Aaron Burr also came into Washington like Trump, kind of an outsider, maybe naively too. They both thought people will love me. I've been elected. I'm here. Burr found out even from the Jefferson people, and I credit Burr in the book with really getting Jefferson elected. Jefferson ran 3 times for president. First time he lost to John Adams. Burr was his vice presidential candidate. Jefferson ended up being the vice president because our system was a little wacky, still being built out. I can't imagine that now, like that Trump would want Tim Walz as his vice president. What happened? Or, it's like, wait, I got stuck with this guy? It's a little better then because you're talking about Adams and Jefferson, right? Right. Anybody that I don't know if they complained back then, like, we can't get good candidates. What are you talking about? I gave you Adams, I gave you Jefferson. Right. Now we do complain all the time. Like, it's a choice. I have to make it, but I don't like either one. You hear so many people say that. But, Burr went there thinking, on the second election, Jefferson served as vice president for that term. Burr went back to New York, where he's from, just like Trump. He worked to make sure that the General Assembly was elected that would favor him and Jefferson, because at that time, the General Assemblies of all the states were the decider of how your electoral votes went. That's how they didn't do it by the popular vote in your state. They did it by your elected officials. Yep. Another thing they changed. But so Burr made sure those were all going to be Jefferson votes. They were. He changed New York from Adams to Jefferson. Jefferson had the South with Virginia and so forth. And so they won. The problem is Burr and Jefferson tied. So technically, Congress had to decide who's the president, who's the vice president. Yeah. We've gotten rid of that too, thank God. Yeah. But, and then we found they had the election. Burr didn't really take place. in it. He went to New York, went back to New York, sat it out. But a lot of the Jeffersonian people were mad because they thought Burr should stand up and say something. They weren't fans of Burr to start with, and it was Jefferson that made sure he was on the ticket for that second election. You know, Jefferson made some deals, made himself president, but the relationship was strained. And the Jefferson people, who we kind of call the Jefferson or the Virginia Mafia, Madison, Monroe, those people wanted someone from Virginia to be elected president forever, which they did pretty well, by dumping Burr eventually. Burr, for the third time when Jefferson ran, Burr was kicked off the ticket. Jefferson put it as, I'm not going to get involved. I'm going to let the party decide. Well, the party was Madison, Monroe, and those other Virginia guys, and Burr was left off the ticket despite the work he had done to get Jefferson elected the first time, it shows you politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was dirty then, it's dirty now.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where the swamp originates from. And over the years, we've had different battles with the swamps. I reference another author who wrote about 5 different swamps. It's probably been with us from the beginning of the country. But, we've had Kennedy fight, the FBI and CIA, and Reagan fight, the bureaucratic swamp. Lincoln fought what they call the slavery swamp. And, there's been 5 of them, including Trump's. So it's not a new concept, but, probably one they missed out is Burr had to fight the same thing. It's that entrenched, battle that you have.
As I mentioned, media bias plays a big role in your book and other interviews. Donald Trump calls it fake news. How is there any correlation to Aaron Burr when we didn't have television back then?
Yeah, we didn't have television, but we had bias in the media, that's for sure. We had, what was known as the party press era. And in the book, I detail about how journalism has changed over the years and the different eras we've had. The party, everybody that studies journalism knows about yellow journalism, which happened later on. Ironically, like with the Hearst family. But the prior to that, the party press era is when Burr was around. And that era, the political parties either owned the publications or they were suppliers of advertising revenue through government and other things. And, for instance, Alexander Hamilton started the New York Post. Still around. I like the paper, actually. But, that was his. Another editor for a paper was employed by Jefferson when he was Secretary of State. He was on the government payroll, and he was an editor for the paper. So he was getting paid as a government employee to really write as an editor. You had Joseph Hamilton Davies, who was the prosecutor in Kentucky. He prosecuted Aaron Burr for treason. And he also was an editor of a paper at the same time. And in the book, we go through that trial about how he was reporting on his own trial, and he was a witness. So he was, we call it the trifecta, but that kind of conflict was around. So Burr had to deal with the same kind of issues. It's pretty well documented, mostly by Trump, that there's a bias in the media. But I'll tell you what, more and more people believe it now, maybe than they did when we first started saying it 10 years ago.
Right.
As often happens.
A lot of the media called Trump an election denier. You put some effort into the book to look at the history of election denials. Can you talk about that and how the media has influenced whether one is labeled an election denier and the other's not?
Yeah, it's really funny because when you start to think about it, the media acts as if Trump is the first guy to question the results of elections. In local elections, having been involved helping people get elected and running myself, a lot of people deny the election. The first thing you do if you lose is you look at the tapes and you're like, how could that be? People love me. How could they not vote for me? Or you see the discrepancy of how many votes and you're thinking, it's impossible. because you feel like you were knocking on doors or talking to people and they were with me, and I'm sure when you run a presidential campaign, you get that same feeling that you're in it.
Right.
And, Trump had done a good job, so he thought, I'm getting reelected. Uh, you look at how the media treats that, though, and they constantly say the election denial, by Trump, or they'll say he refuses to concede that he lost. And, even still, he says the election was stolen. It's been debunked. They use debunked. Contrast that with um, Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, up to the 2024 election, I think in the book I have the exact date when she's saying it, she is talking about how the election was stolen from her, that there's no way she could have lost.
Right.
And she uses New York and California as examples. And yes, she did win. I think she had a $3 million or 3 million person advantage in those places, but we don't elect by the popular vote. It's nice if you can win that, but that gets balanced by the electoral votes. And if you're not campaigning in New York and California like Trump wasn't, well, you're probably not getting many votes there anyhow. He doesn't need them. But, the Democrats refused to certify the election for George Bush in 2000. Said he won the election eventually by saying he won 5-4, pointing to the Supreme Court decision 5-4 in Gore versus Bush. 2016, they actively reached out to electors, Republican electors, to say don't certify Trump as the winner.
Yep.
Exactly what Trump was then accused of, having this alternate slate. It's worse, actually.
Yeah.
At least alternate electors has been done before, so it's not a big surprise. But they called Trump the election denier. Stacey Abrams was claiming she was the governor of Georgia for years after she lost.
Yeah.
She did okay. She made a lot of money off of NGOs and such.
Oh yeah.
It's the way the media treats those people, and they never say, you'll never hear Hillary Clinton, the election denier.
No.
Instead, they'll say she conceded. Well, she did make a phone call. If you call that a conceded, and then immediately was out there saying it was stolen from her, and Russian collusion was her baby.
Right.
I mean, her feet should be held to the fire. As an attorney, I look at it like, if there's evidence, go after them. If you don't, I'm thinking you're going to get more criticism for not looking at cases. Because do we have a multi-tiered system for crime? Because if you did it or I did it, for instance, Letitia James, if it's true, and I haven't seen the document, I've only read the indictment, if it's true that she said that she was getting this property for herself and she wasn't going to rent it out, and that's part of the application, then yes, you committed mortgage fraud. I mean, and you should be prosecuted for it because, years ago, I'd done a lot of real estate law, and I remember talking to some people and, telling them, well before technology became so prominent, some people would change like their tax returns and give those to the bank. Those are the easiest, it used to be, and I assume it still is if people are faking tax returns. They take a certain number every year and they look at, they just pull them on these mortgages. It's willy-nilly for the most part, although I assume Letitia James wasn't willy-nilly. That was probably done on purpose. But they take those documents and then they double check. They check your tax returns that are filed with the IRS. And someone with the FBI had told us, well, that's the easiest case in the world. We then go to the person's house, knock on the door, sit down with them, ask them a question, like, did you file the application or was it truthful? Once they say yes, we have them for lying to the FBI. Then we show them the documents and we have them for mortgage fraud because they have committed mortgage fraud. Comey, I think his case was with lying to Congress. And from hearing the tapes on what he said, he sure was misleading Congress, if not outright lying. From what I heard, that seems like a misstatement of fact. I don't know how you twist that around. I I know it's difficult on perjury, so maybe there's a way he can explain it, but I think it's he should be prosecuted for it because I would be and you would be. And Bolton, it's funny with Bolton with the idea of top secret records and all that. My opinion has been the government marks everything top secret. Like there's some guy that's just stamping everything, and then all these people, and it hasn't only been Bolton. They accuse Trump of having stuff, Biden, Mike Pence. Oh, if Mike Pence is taking top secret, and you're like, I wouldn't think he would do anything like that. And the truth is, maybe all these documents shouldn't be things that are not disclosed to the public. What's so important that they're taking? But if he did it and it's technically a violation, yes, then you should be prosecuting that.
I would agree with that as well, sir. I'm curious on this next one, and what do you think changed the trajectory of the 2024 election? Was it the lawfare or Trump being shot? Was it him serving up fries at McDonald's? The garbage truck? I mean, there's so many memorable moments. What do you think stands out and changed the trajectory?
This concludes the first half of our conversation. Stay tuned next Wednesday as we dive into the second half. Thank you for listening. This is the Martin Memo.